In one study of Greek nurses, more than half, about 56%, were struggling with insomnia a year after the pandemic's peak. Burnout impacted 46.8% of them, showing how widespread emotional exhaustion had become. Researchers found that stress wasn't simply one more symptom, it was the starting point of a chain reaction. But what determined where that chain led wasn't stress alone, it was anxiety, which strengthened the link between stress and depression. That finding reshaped how experts think about recovery. And it raises a deeper question: if stress begins the process, why does its impact spiral so differently from one person to another? Stress might start the process, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Have you ever noticed how two people can go through the same strain at work, yet only one spends the night wide awake, replaying the day? If stress were the single cause, every pressured person would end up in the same restless loop. But that's not how it works. Some shake it off after a few hours of downtime. Others spiral into sleeplessness that lingers for weeks. Clearly, another layer shapes what happens next. Here's the thing. Stress acts as the trigger, but it rarely operates on its own. It sets off a chain of reactions that depend on how your mind and body process it. Most people think stress draws a direct, straight line to burnout or poor sleep, but research paints a more complex picture. What matters is what stress activates. And evidence shows that depressive symptoms often form the main link between stress and insomnia, functioning as a mediator in that chain, not just an outcome. In a study of Greek nurses conducted a year after intense pandemic pressures, researchers explored exactly this interaction. Levels of stress, depressive symptoms, burnout, and insomnia were all high, but when they analyzed how these factors connected, one stood out strongly. Depressive symptoms explained 40.6% of the variance in insomnia scores, the largest share by far, while burnout accounted for 7.6% and stress itself for only 1.3%. That means depression carried most of the weight in turning stress into sleeplessness. So, while stress may launch the reaction, it's the lingering depressive feelings that sustain it. Think of stress as the initial spark setting things in motion. Depressive symptoms function as the fuel that keeps the process burning through the night. They bridge the short-term flare of stress into a longer-term disruption that's harder to shut down. Once sleep begins to falter, the pattern reinforces itself. Poor rest amplifies negative emotions and weakens resilience to daily challenges. Irritability builds, small frustrations hit harder, and even regular tasks start to feel heavier. That exhaustion deepens the depressive layer, which then feeds back into stress, cementing a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to break. Still, not everyone who feels under persistent pressure enters that cycle, and that's what makes this process so unpredictable. Some people experience stress without sliding into depression or insomnia. Others, under similar conditions, do. The variability points to a deeper regulatory mechanism shaping whether stress leads to temporary fatigue or a sustained emotional collapse. That mechanism is anxiety. It doesn't simply join the mix, it regulates how forcefully stress translates into depressive symptoms. When anxiety runs high, stress exerts a stronger pull toward depression and sleep loss. When anxiety is lower, that link weakens. Understanding this interaction is the next step in seeing how stress transforms, or doesn't, into lasting exhaustion. Here's where anxiety steps in as the true amplifier. It doesn't just add to stress, it reshapes how stress operates inside your system. Think of stress as a signal meant to alert and then subside once the pressure passes. Under normal conditions, that signal rises, peaks, and eventually fades as your body returns to equilibrium. But when anxiety runs high, that recovery phase stalls. The same stress feels sharper, lasts longer, and keeps the body stuck in a state of alert long after the original challenge is over. At first glance, it might appear that stress alone is the problem behind sleepless nights and sinking motivation. But research shows that anxiety magnifies stress's impact by interfering with the body's ability to calm itself. Stress may initiate the chain, yet anxiety dictates the intensity of that chain's response. It heightens how stress is registered, interpreted, and maintained, turning what could have been a short spike of strain into an ongoing pattern of tension and depletion. In the study of frontline nurses, stress by itself predicted only limited changes in depressive symptoms. But when anxiety levels were high, the connection between stress and depression intensified markedly. That amplification demonstrates anxiety's role as the moderator. It strengthens the stress to depression pathway, making the same level of stress far more emotionally damaging for some people than for others. This effect becomes clearer when you look at how the body's stress system operates. Stress activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal (HPA) axis, triggering cortisol release to mobilize energy and keep you alert. Normally, this system has an internal brake, the parasympathetic response, that steps in to quiet things down once a threat resolves. High anxiety disrupts that rhythm. It keeps the HPA axis running, maintains elevated cortisol, and prevents the body from fully resetting. The result is prolonged physical and emotional hyperarousal, as if the system's off switch has been delayed. Neuroscience helps explain what happens next. Chronic stress already changes communication between the amygdala, which detects threat, and the hippocampus, which manages context and memory. When anxiety heightens amygdala reactivity, those circuits become overstimulated. The brain starts to favor patterns of vigilance, rumination, and hesitation, mental loops that trap you in overthinking and wear down resilience. Instead of returning to a baseline, your mind keeps scanning for risk. That's why ordinary recovery methods often fail when anxiety remains high. The stress response has effectively been reprogrammed to stay on. This interaction between anxiety and stress helps explain everyday differences in how people cope under pressure. Two individuals facing the same workload can show opposite outcomes. One bounces back after rest, the other continues to feel wired and fatigued. The difference lies in how anxiety amplifies the stress signal across brain and body, extending its reach into mood and sleep. Understanding this mechanism reframes the next step. The challenge isn't removing stress, it's learning how to quiet the amplifier that turns normal tension into exhaustion. And that leads directly into one central question: how can you begin turning the volume down so that stress doesn't take over your system? Now we focus on what really helps you regain control, the practical ways to turn down that internal volume. Once anxiety is seen as the amplifier, the strategy changes. Broad stress relief tips rarely go far enough. Relaxation apps or herbal teas might ease things briefly, but for people with high anxiety, those effects fade fast because their system doesn't switch off as easily. To make real progress, the approach has to match how intense your anxiety is. Research shows that anxiety alters the slope connecting stress and depression. It functions like an internal dial. When anxiety is low, stress creates only a mild ripple and your body resets with rest. When anxiety is high, the same stress sends a sharper signal that reaches deeper into sleep and mood. That means you can't rely on one-size-fits-all stress fixes. Strategies must be tailored to quiet the amplifier so pressure stops building into exhaustion. The goal isn't to erase stress. It's to recondition how your mind and body respond so stress feels proportionate again. For high anxiety, that begins with cognitive approaches that directly target the mental loops keeping you alert long past the threat. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, is one of the best supported paths. It doesn't just help you fall asleep, it helps you rethink the connection between worry, exhaustion, and control. Studies show that worry and difficulty relaxing are core connecting points between anxiety, depression, and insomnia. CBTI works by disrupting these links, decoupling intrusive thought patterns from emotional reactivity, and giving you tools to de-escalate when that chain reaction begins. Mindful awareness training adds another layer. When you learn to observe anxious thought shifts without engaging them, you weaken the grip on your nervous system. Structured breathing works along the same line. Slow, deep exhalations cue the body to move from alertness toward repair by easing cortisol output. These are not abstract ideas. Consistent use over time gently retrains your baseline, allowing stress responses to rise and fall instead of staying trapped in high tension. Other physical habits help reinforce that calmer state. Regular movement, especially activities like walking, yoga, or Tai Chi, reduces muscle tension and steadies breathing rhythm. Combined, these practices create physiological space for stress to move through instead of becoming stored strain. Social connection matters too. Conversations with supportive people act as pressure relief valves, signaling safety to the body and reminding it to step out of constant vigilance. When anxiety begins to settle, its entire network of effects adjusts. Emotional fatigue eases, concentration improves, and sleep becomes more restorative. Lowering the amplifier cuts off excess stress before it filters through depression into insomnia. It's not about being stress-free but being responsive rather than reactive. And as these responses recalibrate, something else emerges, a sense that the system is beginning to work with you again instead of against you, ready for whatever the next challenge demands. When it comes to recovery, it helps to remember what's actually driving the process. Anxiety doesn't just sit on top of stress, it shapes how strongly that stress pushes into depression and how easily it interferes with sleep. Progress isn't about removing stress altogether. It's about adjusting the internal settings so its impact stays manageable. As you quiet that amplifier, something practical happens: your mind frees up bandwidth. You regain cognitive margin, the space needed for clear judgment, deeper thinking, and better decisions. Try one small adjustment this week that helps your system reset. Subscribe for more lessons on psychology, finance, and decision-making.